There are places on this earth that hold their secrets the way the sea holds drowned cities. Not by hiding them exactly, but by covering them in a silence so complete, so ancient and so patient, that the question of what lies beneath only arrives in the quietest hours, when the world has grown still enough, when the mind has released its grip on the familiar and begins, without entirely meaning to reach towards something older. Tonight we are going to a desert. Or rather, we are going to a place that was once something else entirely. A place that the sand has claimed so completely, so thoroughly, that it takes a certain quality of attention even to believe the evidence. The evidence is there, in stone, in bone, in the walls of canyons where ancient hands recorded, with a painter's precision and a witness's urgency, a world that no longer exists in any form, a living eye can see. You are listening to Midnight Sleep Chronicles, and tonight our archives open around a mystery written not in the language of living things, but in their absence. In the space where rivers once ran and have not run for 5,000 years. In the outline of a lake that stretched where there is now only sand and heat and silence that goes all the way down. Let your body settle now. Let the day release from the places where it gathered without being invited. There is nothing required of you in the hours ahead, except the quiet practice of being present, breathing, while we follow a very old thread together. A thread that leads back through the centuries to a world that humanity once loved and lost, and has been trying, in story after story, across every civilization that came after, to remember. We begin in the southeastern corner of Algeria, where the country shares its borders with Libya and Niger, and the land has been scoured by wind for so long that the sandstone itself looks tired. There is a plateau that rises approximately 500 meters above the surrounding desert plain. It is called Tassili Nadjer, a name that translates from the ancient Tamahak language of the Tuareg people as the Plateau of Rivers. And when you are standing on its surface now, in the 21st century, in air so dry it seems to remove moisture from memory itself, that name sounds less like a description and more like a grief. A river has not run here in millennia. The land below the plateau is one of the most forbidding surfaces on Earth. A terrain of sculpted sandstone and shifting dune known to the Tuareg nomads as the Tenere, which in their language means emptiness, or desert within a desert. And yet, if you were to move through the narrow stone corridors of the plateau, through the passages that wind between columns of eroded rock that look in certain lights like the ruins of a civilization rather than the work of wind and time. If you were to follow a Tuareg guide through these labyrinthine canyons to the places where the cliff faces have been sheltered from the worst of the weather, you would find something that should not be there. Something that stops you the way only certain things stop you. Not with urgency, but with a particular stillness that arrives when the eye encounters a thing it is not prepared to process through its usual categories. On these smooth stone walls, rendered in ochre and manganese and chalk the color of dried bone, there are images, more than 15,000 of them, according to the count that archaeologists have assembled over nearly a century of systematic documentation. They run along the cliff faces of the plateau for hundreds of kilometers. They depict, with a skill that has caused scholars to reach for words like masterfully rendered and extraordinary naturalism, a world that exists nowhere in the surrounding landscape. Elephants, giraffes with their long, improbable necks reaching toward trees that are no longer there, hippopotamuses wallowing in rivers that have not flowed for 5,000 years, crocodiles, antelope in enormous herds, cattle with the sweeping horns of a breed that has not been seen in this region since the climate changed and took the grasslands with it. And among the animals, unmistakably human. People swimming. People swimming in bodies of water that the present desert has swallowed completely, in postures so relaxed and so comfortable that they speak not of survival, but of pleasure, not of necessity, but of something much harder to name. The ease of a life lived in abundance. The particular contentment of a body doing exactly what a body was made to do in a landscape that asks nothing difficult of it. The French archaeologist Henri Lot, who spent years in the 1950s and 60s documenting what he called the greatest museum of prehistoric art in the whole world, was working from sketches made by a French Foreign Legion officer named Lieutenant Brennans, who had first encountered the paintings in the 1930s while crossing the plateau on patrol. Brennans had understood immediately that what he was seeing was significant, had sat for hours in the shadow of the cliff, making careful drawings of images that had been made by hands that knew this landscape as intimately as he knew France, and had donated hundreds of his sketches to a museum in Algiers with the slightly stunned manner of a man who has walked into a room he did not expect to find inside a building he thought he knew. What Brennans had found, and what Lotte would spend years mapping and cataloging, was not simply art. It was a record, a climate archive written in pigment. The images at Tassili are arranged in layers that correspond, with a precision that archaeology has confirmed through decades of patient analysis, to the successive phases of a world in transition. The oldest images, belonging to what researchers now call the wild fauna period, beginning around 10,000 years before the Common Era, show animals that require abundant water and lush vegetation. The hippopotamus, the elephant, the rhinoceros, the crocodile. These are not the animals of a desert. They are the animals of a savanna, of a world with rivers and lakes and grasslands extending as far as the eye could reach in any direction from this plateau, moving through the layers, through the pastoral period that followed, where cattle appeared and human figures became more prominent, and the animals of the savanna began to thin toward the horizon of the art. You can watch in slow motion the drying of a world, the grasslands retreating, the rivers narrowing, the great herds diminishing toward symbolic traces, toward the simplified outlines of animals remembered rather than animals seen, until finally, in the most recent layers of the images, the camel arrives, that perfect machine of endurance, that animal whose entire biology is organized around the management of scarcity. And you understand that the transformation is complete. The paradise has become a desert. The swimmers have had to find other water, or none. This record is not mythology. It is not interpretation. It is evidence of a kind so direct that it requires almost no translation. The people who painted these walls were painting what they saw. They were painting their world with the particular attention and the particular love that human beings bring to the things they depend on and belong to. They were painting rivers because there were rivers. They were painting swimming because there was water deep enough to swim in, warm enough to enter willingly, present enough to treat as a permanent feature of the landscape rather than a gift. And then, over the slow centuries, the water diminished, and the painters began to paint something different. And eventually the painting stopped, and the plateau of rivers became the plateau of wind. The science that explains this transformation is now so well established that it carries the quiet authority of a fact that has been confirmed from every possible direction. The mechanism is astronomical, an ancient, slow, and entirely impersonal process involving the wobble of the Earth's axis relative to its orbit around the Sun, a phenomenon that scientists call the precession of the equinoxes. The Earth does not travel around the Sun in a perfectly steady, unwobbling path. It wobbles, the way a spinning top wobbles, completing one full wobble cycle approximately every 26,000 years. This wobble changes the timing of the seasons relative to the Earth's position in its orbit. And the timing of the seasons, it turns out, is not merely a calendar matter. It governs, with enormous consequence, the behavior of the great planetary wind systems, the monsoons, the trade winds, the atmospheric rivers that carry moisture from the ocean across the land, during the period, that scientists now call the African Humid period, which lasted from approximately 14,000 to 5,000 years ago. The Earth's axial wobble had positioned the northern hemisphere in such a way that summer insolation, the amount of solar energy striking the northern land masses during the hottest months, was significantly greater than it is today. This increased summer heating drove the African monsoon northward, far beyond its present limit. The tropical rains that today fall on the Sahel, the narrow belt of semi-arid land along the southern edge of the Sahara, moved north, deep into what is now the most arid terrain on Earth, bringing with them the rainfall that filled the lakes and fed the rivers and grew the grasslands that fed the animals that the painters of Tassili recorded on their walls. Paleoclimate researchers have reconstructed this world from cores drilled from the beds of dried lakes, from the pollen preserved in ancient sediment, from the chemical signatures left in cave formations and in the organic matter buried beneath the sand. The picture they have assembled is of a landscape transformed so completely that it has no modern analog anywhere on Earth. Lakes formed across the Sahara of a scale that is almost impossible to imagine from the present landscape. One lake, designated Paleo Lake Megachad, occupied a basin in what is now southern Libya and northern Niger and Chad at a size approaching that of the Caspian Sea. An inland ocean in a place that receives today less than 10 millimeters of rain per year, in a place where the temperature regularly exceeds 50 degrees Celsius. That lake was full of fish. Its shores were covered with grass. Elephants came to drink from it. Peak rainfall rates during the African Humid period have been reconstructed at over 1,400 millimeters per year in some parts of the Sahara, comparable to the rainfall of a tropical forest, in a region that now averages less than 25. The change was not gradual in the way we usually imagine geological change. It was rapid, at least by the standards of deep time. The monsoon advanced northward quickly. The lakes filled quickly. The vegetation followed quickly. The Sahara did not edge toward greenness. It tipped into it, the way a balance tips when the weight shifts past a critical point. And then, around 5,000 years ago, the balance tipped back. The Earth's wobble had carried the axial alignment past the peak of summer insolation enhancement. The monsoon began to retreat southward. Slowly at first, a few seasons drier than the last, the lake levels dropping almost imperceptibly, the animals at the water's edge moving on. Then faster. The vegetation that had carpeted the desert had itself been sustaining the rainfall. Through the complex feedback loops by which living plant cover affects the atmosphere above it, increasing cloud formation, reducing the reflectivity of the land surface, drawing more moisture from the air. As the plants thinned, these feedbacks weakened. As the feedbacks weakened, the rain diminished further. As the rain diminished, more plants died. The system that had sustained itself for 9,000 years began to collapse. And the collapse, once begun, was faster than the construction had been. There is something worth pausing on here, in the comfortable darkness. The particular poignancy of a collapse driven not by failure, but by success. The Green Sahara did not end because it was misused. It did not end because anyone made a mistake. The very abundance it had produced the vegetation that covered the land, the lakes that gave back moisture to the sky, the intricate web of feedbacks between the living world and the atmosphere above it. All of this had made the system more stable, had amplified and sustained the rains far beyond what the orbital mechanics alone would have predicted. The green Sahara clung to itself. It used the tools of abundance to resist the return of scarcity. And it lost, eventually, because the physics that had created it was patient and persistent and did not care that what it was dismantling was beautiful. This is where the story meets the bone. In a place called Gobero, hidden within the Tenere Desert of Niger, the desert within a desert, the emptiness within the emptiness. In the year 2000, a paleontologist named Paul Sereno was searching for dinosaur fossils in the Cretaceous sandstone of the region when his team happened upon something from a completely different era. Bones. Human bones lying in the sand, and not just a few. As Sereno and his team began to map the site, they realized they were standing on the largest Stone Age cemetery in the Sahara, perhaps the oldest known cemetery anywhere in Africa. Approximately 200 burials, arrayed across the dunes at the edge of a lake that had dried up thousands of years before Sereno arrived. The people buried at Gobero had lived during the African Humid period. They had fished in the lake whose shoreline their graves now overlooked from above, the lake that had been gone for so long that no living tradition had any memory of it. They had buried their dead with care and with ceremony. An archaeologist who had spent nearly 3 decades excavating Stone Age sites in northern Africa traveled to Gobero in the year after its discovery and stood for a long time, gazing at a landscape of ancient graves that contained more human skeletons than she had seen in all her previous digs combined. She identified the pottery of 2 distinct cultures. The older group, the Kiphian, were tall and powerfully built, sometimes reaching well over 6 feet in height, hunters and fishers who had lived here during the wettest period, when the lake was deep enough to hold 6-foot Nile perch and the surrounding savanna supported elephants, and giraffes, and the full complement of what is now the Serengeti. The younger group, the Tenerian, arrived after a gap of several centuries during which the region had dried briefly and emptied. And they were more lightly built, pastoral people who herded cattle alongside fishing and hunting, who adorned themselves with necklaces and bracelets carved from ivory and eggshell. Their burials speak in a language that requires no translation. A teenage girl wearing a bracelet carved from a hippopotamus tusk. An adult male seated on the shell of a mud turtle, placed there with a deliberateness that implies belief in something beyond the purely practical. A 12-year-old boy buried with his hands clasped under his head like a pillow, holding in his right hand the skeleton of a small bird. The oldest record of a person buried with an animal companion, yet found in Africa, and possibly in the world. And then, in the last days of one excavation season, a burial that brought the entire team to a standstill. Lying on her side, the skeleton of a Tenerian woman, and facing her, the skeletons of 2 young children, their slender arms extended toward each other across the sand, their fingers clasped in an arrangement so deliberate, so specific, so unmistakably an expression of love fixed against the coming darkness, that the archaeologists who uncovered it could not simply continue. These people had not known that the desert was coming. They had not known that the lake at whose edge they laid their dead would disappear, that the grass would thin, that the rain would stop arriving on schedule and then stop arriving at all. They had lived at the edge of the lake for 5,000 years, fishing and hunting and burying their dead and carving their bracelets and painting their cattle on the walls of the plateau to the north. And then, around 4,500 years ago, the climate began its slow deterioration to present-day arid conditions and the humans no longer lived permanently at Gobero, but migrated through the area with livestock, sometimes leaving a hearth or discarding their pottery. And then the migrations thinned, and eventually, the archaeological record at Gobero simply came to a close. Not with violence, not with disease, with dryness, with the slow, impersonal withdrawal of the rain that had made everything possible. There is a detail from the Gobero excavations that has stayed with researchers, and that deserves a moment's attention in the dark. Among the hundreds of burials at the site, spread across 5,000 years of occupation, the archaeologists found evidence not just of death, but of care. The persistent, particular, stubborn human insistence on treating the dead as though they are still, in some sense, present. An adult male was found seated on the shell of a mud turtle, as if on a throne or some other elevated position that carried symbolic weight for the people who placed him there. Another adult male was interred with his skull resting on a portion of a ceramic vessel, his head, in death, cushioned by the work of human hands. The posture implies not just burial, but the careful arrangement of a body into a position of comfort, as if the living believed they were placing the dead in a position from which the dead might continue to experience something worth being comfortable for. The Tenerian culture that produced these burials was already living in a world that was deteriorating. The lake that had once been deep enough for Nile perch was shallowing. The wide herds of the early Holocene were thinning. The landscape was becoming less generous with each generation, in ways that a careful observer could measure. And yet the care with which the dead were laid to rest did not diminish as the world diminished. If anything, the most elaborate burials at Gobero, the most deliberate, the most adorned, the most clearly expressive of a belief that the dead person was going somewhere and deserved to be sent off properly, come from the later phases of occupation, from the people who were living closest to the end of the green world they had inherited. The richness of the ceremony increased as the resources that sustained it decreased. As if, when the world begins to take things away, the human response is to give more deliberately, more carefully, more completely to what remains. This pattern, ceremony intensifying at the threshold of loss, is one of the constants of the human record. The paintings of Lascaux were made by people living at the end of a long glacial period, when the mammoth herds that had defined the landscape of Ice Age Europe were beginning their long retreat northward. The most extraordinary rock art of Tassili, the most skilled, the most vivid, the most saturated with the colors of a living world, dates to the pastoral period when the savanna was already thinning toward Hiraeth, the desert it was becoming. The most elaborate of the Egyptian funerary texts were composed during periods when the Nile's floods were failing and the civilization was under pressure from the advancing desert. The human animal responds to the approach of absence by making art, by writing things down, by burying the dead with care, by insisting in the face of everything that is being taken, on the reality and the value of what remains. The laboratory has given us what it can tonight. We carry its facts, the pollen cores, the lake sediments, the bones in the sand, into older waters where different kinds of knowing move, where what cannot be measured is still, sometimes, the most important thing. Before there were paleoclimatologists, there were the stories. And before the stories were written down, they moved through populations the way certain things move, carried not in cells, but in the architecture of memory, passed from voice to ear across the slow centuries, accumulating the weight of repetition until they became a kind of truth that no single telling could contain. A truth that lived not in any one version, but in the pattern beneath the versions, the shape that persisted through every translation and every retelling and every culture that received it and made it their own. The myth of a lost paradise is perhaps the most widely distributed story in the human record. It appears in some form in every major civilization we have been able to examine, in every tradition that has left sufficient traces for comparison, with a persistence and a specificity that is worth attending to. Not because persistence alone proves truth, but because the particular shape of what is described, the particular quality of what is mourned, maps with unusual precision onto what the climate science has now confirmed. The Greek poet Hesiod, writing in the 8th century before the Common Era, described what he called the Golden Age as a time when human beings lived like gods. A time before labor, before warfare, before the grinding necessity of extracting survival from a reluctant earth. The earth, in Hesiod's memory, had once offered everything without being asked. It had been generous and mild. The seasons had been gentle. The work of living had been light. This age had ended, and what followed? The Silver Age, the Bronze Age, the Age of Heroes, the Iron Age that Hesiod himself occupied with evident exhaustion and considerable bitterness, was a progressive impoverishment, a slow removal of ease from the world, a cooling of the generosity that had once defined the relationship between the land and the people who lived on it. Hesiod was writing in Greece. He was not writing about the Sahara. And yet, the essential structure of what he described, abundance that was natural and effortless, followed by scarcity that required effort and adjustment, followed by a world organized around the management of that. Scarcity corresponds to a real sequence of events that did in fact occur in the parts of the world that were connected to the drying Sahara through migration and trade and the slow diffusion of peoples across the ancient Mediterranean world. The people who moved out of the drying Sahara between 5,000 and 4,000 years ago, the people who carried their culture and their language and their memories northward and eastward as the lakes retreated, were carrying with them the lived experience of a transformation, not a myth of a golden age. An actual golden age, actual rivers, actual abundance, actual ease, that had become the present scarcity. They knew the before and the after. They had felt the change in their own lifetimes, or had heard it from parents who had felt it, or had felt it in the accumulated weight of stories about the way things used to be. The Sumerian tradition, one of the oldest continuous literary records in human history, preserved in cuneiform tablets that predate the Hebrew scriptures by at least 1,000 years, contains accounts of a time before the flood. Not a simple flood, but a great inundation, a transformation of the world from a form in which the gods were generous and the land was fruitful and the rivers ran where they were needed, to a form in which those conditions had to be created and maintained through effort, through irrigation and canal building and the patient engineering of a landscape that would no longer cooperate on its own. The Sumerian king lists describe reigns of impossible length in this earlier period, thousands of years in some cases, as if the compilers of the record were trying to express the immensity of the time before, the deep geological patience of a world that had once been fundamentally different, by assigning it a duration that ordinary history could not contain. The Vedic tradition of ancient India speaks of a Satya Yuga, a truth age or golden age, in which the principle of cosmic order was whole and unhidden, in which the earth provided without being forced, in which the relationship between the human and the natural was one of mutuality and abundance, rather than extraction and management. The Egyptian concept of Zep Tepi, the first time, described a foundational era when the gods walked among human beings and the world was in its original and perfect form, before the long decline that all of recorded history represents. The Yoruba tradition of West Africa, the Aztec tradition of Mesoamerica, the Aboriginal Australian concept of the Dreamtime a foundational reality that preceded and underlies the present world. Every tradition has its version, and the versions are not identical, but they rhyme. They agree on the essential structure, that the world was once different, that it was once more generous, more alive, more in harmony with what the living body needs, that something happened and changed it, and that the memory of the better world persists, carried in the stories the way a genetic trait persists, forward through time, not diminishing with distance, but accumulating weight, becoming not more specific, but more essential with each telling. The connection between this mythological record and the paleoclimate evidence is not something that archaeology proves in any strict sense. But it is also not something that archaeology can simply ignore. The African Humid period ended approximately 5,000 years ago. The first written records of human civilization, Sumerian cuneiform, the earliest hieroglyphic inscriptions in Egypt, appeared approximately 5,000 years ago. These two facts are not unconnected. The people who built the first cities in the river valleys of Mesopotamia and the Nile Delta were, in part, the inheritors of a drying world. They were people, or the descendants of people, who had lived in a landscape that no longer existed and had carried the memory of it into the new landscape they were building with their own hands. They were encoding, in the very first stories they wrote down, the experience of a transformation that their grandparents had lived through, the experience of a world that had been generous and was no longer. There is a particular quality to this kind of memory, a quality that distinguishes it from simple nostalgia or wishful thinking. The myths of the Golden Age are not vague. They are specific in their geography, bounded by mountains and rivers and coasts, specific in their botany and their zoology, specific in the particular pleasures they describe. The ease of fishing in lakes so full of life that nets were not required. The pleasure of rivers whose cycles could be predicted and whose floods could be counted on to renew the soil. The particular quality of a landscape where the work of survival was light enough to leave room for something else, something that the later traditions would try to encode in various religious and philosophical vocabularies, but that resisted complete articulation, because it was not, at root, a concept. It was an experience. The experience of a body at ease in its landscape, doing exactly what it was made to do, in a world that had made it for the purpose. There is a concept in the Islamic Sufi tradition, and the Sahara was, long before the arrival of Islam, the homeland of a kind of thought that understood the desert as a teacher precisely because of its extremity, because of the way its emptiness made the invisible visible. There is a concept called barzakh, which means isthmus, the thin place between two worlds, the membrane through which things can pass in both directions, but which itself is neither world and belongs entirely to neither. The Sahara is, in a geological sense, a barzakh. It is a place between what it was and what it is, preserving in its sand and its stone the record of both worlds without belonging fully to either. The paintings on the walls of Tassili are the barzakh made visible, the images from one world preserved in the landscape of another, the memory of the river planet in the wall of the desert. The Arab scholar and traveler Ibn Battuta, who crossed the Sahara in the 14th century on his way to the court of the Mali Empire, described the desert in terms that still carry the weight of genuine encounter with something larger than the traveler. He described the isolation, the silence, the particular disorientation that came from a landscape that refused to give the eye anything to fix on. He described how the guides navigated, not by landmarks, since there were none, but by the stars and by a kind of knowledge so embedded in the body that it did not feel like knowledge at all. It felt like sense. Like the way you know, without looking, where your hand is in the dark. The Tuareg navigators of the deep Sahara carried the geography of the desert the way a musician carries a melody. Not in the head, but in the hands. Not as information, but as a readiness. A capacity to respond to the subtlest of cues. The angle of a dune, the temperature of the wind from the north, the way the stars align at the hour before dawn when the sky shows its true depth and the horizon between sand and sky disappears entirely, and you are simply a body moving through space by feel. What Ibn Battuta could not have known, and what the people who guided him could only have preserved as the dimmest of ancestral echoes, was that the sand beneath his feet was covering an earlier world. That the dunes his caravan climbed and descended were the graves of lakes. That the roots between the desert wells, precious, carefully maintained, guarded with a seriousness that reflected their importance as the difference between life and death. Often followed, with a precision that the traveler could not have explained and did not need to explain, courses of rivers that had not run for 3,000 years. This is one of the more remarkable findings to emerge from the satellite and ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Sahara conducted over the past several decades. Beneath the sand, encoded in the subtle topography of the buried landscape, is the ghost of a drainage system. Ancient riverbeds, dry for millennia, that still channel the rare rains that do fall in the desert along paths that were established during the African Humid period. Ancient lake basins that fill briefly and shallowly during exceptional wet years, and then drain and evaporate, and are dry again for decades. The landscape remembers the water even when the water is gone. The land holds the shape of what was, the way certain kinds of grief hold the shape of what was loved, not carrying the thing itself forward, but carrying the outline of it, the trace of the channels it carved on its way through. The Tuareg people who have lived in this, who have landscape for as long as any written record reaches, have a tradition of oral history and navigational knowledge that encodes real information about the ancient topography of the Sahara, their routes between oases, their knowledge of where water can be found in emergency, their reading of the landscape that allows them to predict weather and locate resources in a terrain that looks entirely featureless to the uninitiated. All of this rests on a deep, accumulated knowledge of a landscape that is the dried memory of an earlier, wetter world. They are navigating by the ghost, knowing what the sand covers without knowing in any explicit way that they know it. Moving through a landscape as if it were alive, because, in the relevant sense, it is. Alive with the patterns laid down by the rain that no longer falls and the rivers that no longer run. Patterns that still govern where the groundwater collects and where, in the rare years when the sky delivers more than expected, something green will briefly appear before the sand reclaims it. There is one more thread in the mythological record that deserves attention before we leave it behind, because it speaks to something that the scientific account alone cannot fully convey. In the oldest Egyptian texts, in the cosmological literature of a civilization that built itself at the edge of the drying Sahara, that depended for its survival on the annual flood of the Nile in a landscape that was becoming progressively less forgiving, there is a recurring concept called Zep Tepi, the first time. Zep Tepi was not simply the beginning of the world in the narrative sense of a creation story. It was described as an ongoing reality, a foundational state that underlies and sustains the present, a layer of existence more real than ordinary time precisely because it is not subject to ordinary time's erosion. The gods walked in Zep Tepi. The world in Zep Tepi was whole. The principle of cosmic order, of justice, of the alignment between the human and the divine and the natural, was not yet damaged by the accumulation of human history and its inevitable compromises. The task of the pharaoh, the task of the priests, the task of the elaborate ritual machinery of Egyptian civilization was to maintain contact with Zep Tepi, to keep the thread of connection to the first time from breaking entirely, to prevent the world from drifting too far from its original and perfect form. What strikes a reader of the 21st century, looking at this cosmological project from the perspective of what we now know about the climate history of North Africa, is its grief. Not its confidence, its grief. The people who built the Egyptian civilization were building it in the ruins of the Green Sahara. They were living in a landscape that had once been a savanna and was becoming a desert. Watching the desert advance southward and eastward, watching the rainfall diminish over the centuries of their civilization's existence. They could not have known the mechanism. They could not have known about precession or insulation or monsoon dynamics. But they knew the fact. They knew that the world they inhabited was drier and harder and less generous than the world that the oldest stories described. And they built their entire cosmological system around the project of maintaining connection to that earlier, better world, of keeping Zep Tepi present in the life of the civilization, of performing, in ritual form, the gestures of an abundance that the climate would no longer simply provide. This is what the myth of the Golden Age, in all its cultural variations, actually is. Not a fantasy of what might be, but a ritual preservation of what was. A practice of remembrance, a refusal to let the memory of abundance dissolve entirely into the experience of scarcity. And the reason it persists across so many cultures and so many centuries is not because human beings are prone to wishful thinking, though they are, but because the memory it preserves is real. There was a green world. It is gone now, and the keeping of its memory is not escapism. It is the most important orientation available to a species that was built for conditions that no longer obtain and must live with whatever dignity and creativity it can muster in the conditions that do. We have come a long way tonight, through the evidence and through the echoes, through the painted walls and the buried bones and the myths that carry the shape of a lost world forward through the centuries. We have arrived, as all long journeys eventually do, at the question that was present all along, the question beneath the facts and beneath the stories, the question that the Green Sahara poses not to the scientist or to the mythologist, but to the person lying in the dark, breathing, holding the weight of a world in which things end. How do we live in a world where paradise is not a future promise, but a buried past? The question arrives here with a particular force, because what we have been examining tonight is not an allegory. The Green Sahara is not a poetic metaphor for psychological abundance or spiritual harmony. It was a real place where real rivers ran and real children swam and real mothers died with their real arms around their real children in the sand beside a real lake. And it ended because of a wobble. Because the earth tilts as it spins, and the tilt shifts over thousands of years, and the shift changes the timing of the seasons, and the seasons govern the monsoons, and the monsoons brought the rain, and the rain grew the grass, and the grass fed the animals, and the animals fed the people. And the people painted the walls and buried the dead, and clasped hands in the sand. And then the wobble came back around, as it always does. And the rain stopped, and the grass thinned, and the lake dried, and the paintings remained. This is not a story about human failure. There is no villain here. No one caused the Sahara. No greed, no hubris, No violation of cosmic law brought the sand. The climate changed because the physics of orbital mechanics required it, on a timescale so vast that it dwarfs not just human history, but the very concept of human agency. The people who painted the walls of Tassili were not punished. They were not forgotten by the universe. They were the inhabitants of a moment in the long, impersonal, magnificently indifferent cycling of the Earth's climate. And the moment passed the way all moments pass, and the sand came, and the paintings remained. What does this do to us? What does it mean to know that the world we inhabit is not the only world that has been? That the geography of the present is a thin layer over the geography of the past? And that the geography of the past included conditions of abundance that our species found so hospitable, so generous, so close to what we seem to have been made for, that every major civilization that followed encoded the memory of those conditions in its foundational stories. There is a philosopher named Simone Weil who wrote in the darkest years of the 20th century about what she called the need for roots. She was writing about uprootedness in the social and political sense, about the dislocation of populations torn from their communities, from the living fabric of shared history and shared practice that gives a human life its bearings. But her words carry a resonance that extends beyond and the social, into the geological and the climatic. To be rooted, she wrote, is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. A human being has roots by virtue of real, active, and natural participation in the life of a community, which preserves in living shape certain particular treasures of the past. What she could not have known, and what we now know, is that the deepest roots of our species go into a soil that no longer exists. That the landscape which shaped the earliest human civilizations, shaped the agricultural techniques and the religious practices and the cosmological models and the political structures of the first cities, was itself already a memory of an earlier landscape. A dried and diminished version of the green Sahara, already 3,000 or 4,000 years into its slow retreat toward the present desert. The first farmers of the Nile Valley were, in a precise historical sense, the inheritors of a landscape that the monsoon had already abandoned. They were building their civilization on the shore of a world that had already gone. This is the condition that the myths of the Golden Age are trying to describe, imperfectly and urgently, and with the particular insistence of something that refuses to be forgotten. The experience of being the inheritor of an abundance you did not create and cannot restore. The experience of building on the foundation of a world that is no longer available. The experience of a homesickness for a place that still exists in the body's cellular memory. In the particular ease that the body feels in the presence of running water. In the particular pleasure of lying on grass in the warmth of a sun that is strong but not brutal. In the involuntary deepening of the breath that happens when the air is cool and moist and carries the smell of living soil, even when that place has been desert for 5,000 years. The psychologist Carl Jung spent his professional life investigating what he called the collective unconscious. The hypothesis that beneath the individual unconscious, beneath the personal history and the family patterns and the cultural conditioning, there is a layer of inherited psychological structure that is shared across cultures, that carries in its imagery and its dynamics, the accumulated experience not of one life, but of the species. He was careful to say that he was describing a structural inheritance, not a memory bank, not a record of specific historical events. But the question that the Green Sahara poses is whether the structural inheritance might be more concrete than he imagined. Whether the recurring imagery of paradise, of lost abundance, of a generous earth that once was and is no more, carries within it not just a psychological archetype, but an actual ecological memory. The body's record of conditions it was shaped for, and has not stopped expecting to find. The body knows things the century does not yet have language for. The cellular machinery that replicates the architecture of a human being has been copying and transmitting information since long before the Green Sahara ended. Every adaptation that made human life possible in the landscape of the African humid period, the metabolism that manages water with a certain efficiency, the sensory systems tuned to the colors and textures of a savanna landscape, the particular pleasures of open water and abundant food and social warmth that still feel, to contemporary humans, like the basic vocabulary of well-being. All of these were shaped during or before the period of the Green Sahara, in conditions that no longer exist, and they persist, maintained by the faithful machinery of cellular replication through every generation since the climate changed, as if the body has not yet received the message that the world it was built for is gone. This is not a pathology. The persistence of these adaptations is not a failure of the genome to update itself. It is, in the relevant sense, a record. The body is an archive of conditions that shaped it, carrying forward through time the evidence of every world it has inhabited and adapted to, even the worlds that no longer exist. You are, in this sense, a citizen of the Green Sahara, not metaphorically. Your body was built over 100,000 years of incremental refinement in and for the conditions of an Africa that included the Green Sahara as a central feature of the habitable world. The ease you feel beside water, the pleasure of warmth without brutality, the particular comfort of a landscape that offers shelter and abundance without demanding vigilance and effort. These are not preferences. They are memories of a world that was real and that shaped everything that came after, including you. This realization carries a weight that deserves to be held here in the dark, rather than hurried past. Because what it implies is not consoling in any simple way. It implies that the homesickness, the grief for a world that seems to have been lost before you were born, the longing that some people feel for a place they have never visited and cannot describe but recognize with certainty when they encounter it in a landscape, or a piece of music, or a quality of afternoon light. That this is not a malfunction, not a neurosis, not a misapplication of the human capacity for longing to an object that does not exist. It is the most accurate possible response to a real historical fact. The world that you were built for is not the world you live in. The Welsh language has a word, Hiraeth, that has no direct equivalent in English, and that every attempt to translate somehow loses something essential. It means something like longing for a home that either cannot be returned to, or may never have existed in exactly the form it is remembered. It carries within it the sorrow of homesickness for a place that exists more clearly in the feeling than in any geography you could point to on a map. Hiraeth is not sadness exactly. It is more like the ache of recognition, the recognition of something that was yours and is no longer yours, or that has always been yours and has not yet been found. It is the feeling that arrives when a particular landscape, a certain quality of light, a certain arrangement of silence and sound produces in you something that exceeds what the sensory data alone should be able to account for. If you feel something like Hiraeth when you contemplate the oldest questions, the ones about belonging, about whether this extraordinary planet is truly home, about why certain landscapes feel more familiar than the ones you grew up in. That feeling is not a malfunction. It is not a symptom to be treated. It is, perhaps, the oldest data available. The record, maintained in the cellular memory of the body across 5,000 years of desert. of a world that knew how to give what the human animal was built for, and gave it freely, and for a very long time. This is the dark side of the knowledge, and it deserves to be acknowledged before we move toward the other side, because the other side is only true if the dark side is also true, and pretending the dark side is not there produces not comfort, but a diminished thing, a consolation that does not console, because it has not been earned. Here is the dark side of that knowledge, and it deserves to be held clearly before we move through it. The world that you were built for is not entirely the world you live in. The landscape that shaped the body, that shaped the particular pleasure of open water and warm grass and air that carries the smell of living soil. That landscape is, in its fullest form, 5,000 years gone. The homesickness that some people feel for a place they cannot name or locate on any map is not a symptom. It is a form of accuracy. The body is reporting the distance between what it was shaped for and what it has. And then, moving through the dark side, not past it, but through it. The other side of the same truth. The world you live in is also the world you were built for, because your ancestors survived the transition. The people who moved out of the drying Sahara and into the river valleys, who built the first cities and invented writing and agriculture and the whole elaborate cultural machinery of civilization. They survived, and you are descended from them. Your genome carries the record not just of the abundance, but of the adaptation to its loss. The capacity to grieve what has ended and continue living is not a small thing. It is, perhaps, the central human competence. The capacity to grieve what has ended and continue living is not a small thing. It is, perhaps, the central human competence. The capacity to carry the memory of what was lost without being paralyzed by it. To use that memory as a standard of value, as a source of information about what the living body needs and what the living community requires, without mistaking the memory for a destination, without spending the present life trying to return to a past that cannot be returned to. This is what the best of the mythological traditions have always been trying to teach, encoded in their stories of golden ages and fallen paradises. Not the return itself, but the orientation, the direction, the knowledge of what you are reaching toward, even when the destination is not recoverable in any literal sense. Consider for a moment what it means to be the kind of creature that can know all of this, that can read the rock art and extract the climate data and reconstruct the lake and comprehend the orbital mechanics and feel, somewhere underneath all of that knowledge, the grief of a world that ended before any living person's memory reaches. The other animals who lived in the green Sahara, the elephants, the giraffes, the West African crocodiles who persisted in isolated pools of the Tassili Plateau until well into the 20th century, marooned survivors of a world that had moved on around them. They adapted or they died. They did not mourn. They did not paint the walls. The human capacity to know what has been lost and to carry that knowledge forward as a form of meaning is the strangest and most precious of all the adaptations that the long ages of Earth have produced. It is not comfortable. It is not efficient. It is the source of most of what we would call cultural achievement and most of what we would call cultural suffering. The capacity to be inhabited by worlds that no longer exist, to be accountable to pasts that cannot be changed and futures that cannot be guaranteed, to live in the gap between what the body remembers and what the present offers. But it is also the source of the paintings on the walls of Tassili. It is the source of the grave in the sand where a woman held her children's hands at the edge of a drying lake. It is the source of every story ever told about a world that was once better, every prayer offered toward a perfection that the present cannot contain. every garden planted in defiance of the desert, every child shown the stars and told, we came from somewhere, and we are going somewhere, and the going matters, especially when, the destination cannot yet be seen. There is a theory in complexity science, applied to the dynamics of living systems, still provisional, but suggestive in ways that reward contemplation, that organisms and ecosystems tend to preserve information that was costly to generate, that genetic and neural structures developed under conditions of extreme difficulty and long duration are not easily discarded because the system does not know, cannot know, that the conditions that made them necessary have changed. The body maintains a capacity whose original context has dissolved because the body is faithful. The body does not receive updates about the geological record. It only receives the present, and it handles the present with the tools it built over the entire duration of the past. If that principle applies here, and there is no reason to think it does not, then what we carry in our bodies is not merely biological machinery. It is an archive, a form of memory in the most literal biological sense. A message from a past that we have not yet learned to read, maintained by the faithful machinery of cellular replication through every generation since whatever combination of climate and geography and evolutionary pressure first wrote it. The ease you feel beside running water is a document. The particular pleasure of a warm evening after a cool day is a document. The involuntary slowing of the breath that happens in the presence of something vast and beautiful and indifferent to human categories. That too is a document, written in a language older than any language that has ever been spoken. We are, all of us, repositories of things we do not understand. And this is not a limitation. It is perhaps the most precise description of what it means to be alive, to be the carrier of a signal whose full meaning has not yet arrived. The blood is patient. The cells are patient. The question encoded in the particular pleasure of a body at ease is patient, and it has been waiting far longer than any individual life to be read. The philosopher Blaise Pascal, writing in the 17th century with a precision that has not dated, described the human being as a thinking reed, the most fragile thing in nature, crushable by a drop of water, and yet able to encompass the universe in thought, to know its own finitude, to know that the stars do not know it exists. The greatness of humanity, he wrote, consists in knowing its misery. A tree does not know it is miserable. To know one is miserable. To know the difference between what is and what was, between the world as it is and the world as the body remembers it having been, is to know something that the rest of nature, so far as we can determine, does not know. The painted giraffe on the wall at Tassili is a record of this knowing. The ivory bracelet on the wrist of a buried girl is a record of this knowing. The clasped hands of a mother and two children in the sand of a dried lake are a record of this knowing. There is a practice in certain contemplative traditions, particularly in schools of thought that emerged from desert landscapes, from places where the absence of the usual clutter of vegetation and sound forced the attention inward, of sitting with an unanswerable question, not in order to answer it, but in order to be changed by it. The question is understood not as a problem to be solved, but as a teacher whose teaching is not information, but transformation. Something in the quality of attention that a genuinely unanswerable question requires, held long enough and honestly enough, opens the person who holds it into a different relationship with reality. Not knowing more, but knowing differently, carrying the question more lightly, and alongside the question, carrying themselves more lightly as well. The question of the green Sahara, held in this spirit as a teacher rather than a problem, offers something specific. It offers the particular liberation of understanding that the distance between the world as it is and the world as the body remembers it having been is not a wound to be healed. It is the condition. It is the gap from which everything human and interesting and worth having happened has always emerged. The art and the science and the music and the questions asked in the small hours of the night, all of it coming from the distance between what we are and what we carry in us, from the inability to fully belong to either the present or the past while being shaped by both. The Tenarian woman at Gobero did not belong to the easier world her ancestors had known. She belonged to the drying world, the world of thinning lakes and retreating grass. And yet the world she inhabited retained enough of the earlier world's gifts, enough water, enough warmth, enough community, for her to have children and to love them and to be buried with them, in a pose that says, across 5,000 years of silence, that the world she lived in was worth living in. Not the world she was built for, the world she actually had. And she held it in her arms, in the sand, at the edge of the water. The immunologist and writer Lewis Thomas, who spent his professional life at the intersection of biology and the philosophy of what it means to be alive, wrote near the end of his life that the greatest of all the accomplishments of scientific investigation has been the discovery of human ignorance. And he meant it as a celebration, because the more precisely we understand the structure of what we do not know, the more beautiful the shape of the question becomes. The green Sahara is a beautiful shape of ignorance. Real, datable, distributed across the landscape of the present in the form of dried lake beds and rock paintings and buried bones and the navigational memory of nomadic peoples, pointing toward a world that was and is no more and will be again. A world we cannot enter, can only know about, can only carry in our bodies without quite knowing what we are carrying. There is a quality of attention that the desert teaches, a quality that the Tuareg navigators carried in their bodies across the empty centuries, the ability to hold very large distances in the mind as something close and personal, to treat the absence of landmarks not as disorientation, but as a different kind of clarity. The stars are very clear over the Sahara. They have always been clear over the Sahara, in the green centuries and in the dry ones. And the people who lived under them, the Kifian fishermen and the Tenarian herders and the Tuareg guides who crossed the sand where the lakes used to be, all of them, in their different eras, fell asleep under the same stars. The stars did not change. The sky held its patterns through all of it, through the green and through the drying and through the long silence of the desert. Something in that fact is a steadiness. Something in the permanence of the sky above the impermanence of the land below. It is a place to rest. Sleep is not death, but it shares with death the quality of release, the willingness to let the grip of conscious control loosen, to allow the self to dissolve for a few hours into something less defined and more continuous than the waking identity. Every night that you sleep, you make a small act of trust in the continuity of the world. You trust that the sun will return, that the body will continue its work without the mind's supervision, that the morning will offer what the morning has always offered, which is another chance, another day in the particular world you happen to inhabit, with its imperfections and its distances from everything that was once easy, and its stubbornly recurring gifts. The quality of light at certain hours, the way water sounds, the warmth of another body, the occasional unexpected arrival of something that exceeds what you were expecting from the day. Consider what it means that the Earth keeps this record at all. The orbital mechanics that ended the green Sahara are not malicious. They are not indifferent in the way that cruelty is indifferent. They are indifferent in the way that mathematics is indifferent. operating according to principles that do not take sides, that do not distinguish between the lake that sustains a civilization and the sand that buries it, between the flourishing and the loss. The precession of the equinoxes does not know that it dried the Sahara. The Sahara does not know that it was green. Only we know. Only the strange, late-arriving, remarkably fragile capability of consciousness. The capability that looked at the walls of a canyon and saw, in the paintings of animals that no longer lived there, a record of something that had been lost, allows any of this to be held, contemplated, mourned, and carried forward. There is a concept in ecology called the ghost of predators past. The observation that prey animals in regions where large predators have been absent for centuries still carry in their behavior the responses evolved for a threat that is no longer present. The pronghorn of North America runs faster than any predator currently alive in North America can pursue. It runs at the speed of the cheetahs and lion-like cats that went extinct on the continent at the end of the last ice age, 12,000 years ago. It is running from ghosts. It is outrunning an absence. And this is not a malfunction, and it is not a tragedy. It is a record. The pronghorn's speed is a document of a world that was. The ease that the human body still feels beside water. The particular pleasure of warmth without brutality. The involuntary lifting of something in the chest that happens in the presence of a landscape generous enough to sustain life without demanding constant vigilance. These are the human, equivalent of the pronghorn speed. We are still running at the pace of the green Sahara. We are still reaching for the water of the dried lakes. We are still, in some cellular and pre-linguistic and inarticulate way, expecting the monsoon. And perhaps this expectation is not entirely mistaken. The wobble will come back around. The physics is patient. The 11,000 years between now and the next green Sahara is a long time by any human measure, and no one alive tonight will see it. But the earth is not finished with abundance. The desert is not the final word. The sand that covers the graves at Gobero is not an ending but an interval. A long, dry pause in a planetary conversation that has been going on for 8 million years. A conversation between the orbital mechanics of the solar system and the living world of this particular planet. A conversation in which the green periods and the dry periods alternate with the patience of something that measures time in tens of thousands of years. We are in a dry period. The people at Gobero were in a green period, and before them there were people in another dry period, and before that another green. And so it has gone, cycling back and forth across the face of the Sahara, for longer than the concept of history can contain. The green Sahara is not coming back in any human lifetime. The bones at Gobero will continue to lie in the sand above the dried lake, and the paintings on the walls of Tassili will continue to be visited by the rare traveler who makes it through the stone labyrinth with a Tuareg guide and stands for a moment in front of a painted giraffe in a landscape that contains no giraffes, and feels something that cannot be adequately described as surprise or sadness or wonder, but is something of all three. The feeling of encountering evidence of a world that was real in the ruins of its absence. And yet, the Earth's wobble will bring the green Sahara back. The precession of the equinoxes will complete its cycle in approximately 11,000 years, and the monsoon will advance northward as it has done more than 200 times in the past 8 million years. And the sand will give way to grass, and the rivers will run again in channels that have not carried water since the time of the painted swimmers. No living human being will see it, but it will happen. Because the physics that ended the green Sahara is the same physics that created it. and that physics is patient in the way that only things measured in planetary cycles can afford to be patient. This is not a comfort in any immediate sense. It is something stranger and more durable than comfort. It is the context, the frame within which tonight's question lives. The knowledge that the present condition is not the permanent condition, that the desert is not the essential nature of the Sahara, but only its current configuration, that what the sand covers is not gone, but only waiting for the right angle of sunlight in the right season at the right point in the orbital cycle. The Tenarian people who buried their dead at Gobero with ivory bracelets and bird bones and clay vessels did not know that 5,000 years later, someone from a civilization they could not have imagined would fly to their desert in a machine they could not have conceived, and follow a team of scientists through the heat and the sand to stand above their graves and understand, looking down at the bones of a mother and 2 children, that what those 3 people had shared in their lives and what the hands that arranged them had tried to preserve in their deaths was not so different from what living human beings anywhere on Earth, in any climate, are still trying to say to each other in the presence of endings. We were here. We loved each other. The world was real, and we were in it. Let the question settle now, not away. Let them settle in, the way sediment settles, in still water, finding their own depth, each unanswered thing coming to rest in its own unansweredness. Not as a failure, but as the ongoing shape of a consciousness that is alive enough to be troubled by the right things. The desert is 5,000 years old. The paintings on the walls are 10,000. The bones in the sand are nearly as old as the oldest writing. The wobble that ended the green Sahara will bring it back in 11,000 years. The sun that drove the monsoon northward is 4.5 billion years old and will continue shining for another 5 billion. Against all of that, the span of a single human night is almost nothing. A breath, a heartbeat, a moment of consciousness held briefly open in the dark. And yet, in that moment of consciousness, held briefly open in the dark, is everything. The painted giraffe, the clasped hands, the ivory bracelet, the bird bone, the entire record of a species that has been paying attention to its world since the world was green and cannot stop paying attention even now that the world has changed. Cannot stop painting the walls, cannot stop burying the dead with care, cannot stop asking in every generation and in every language what this world is and where it came from and what it means to be, for however long the climate allows, alive in it. Your body is carrying you tonight, as it always does, through the hours when you are not watching. The cells are doing their ancient work, replicating the patterns that were laid down in conditions you will never see, maintaining a record of a world that is now desert and a world that is now ocean floor, and a world that was, for 9,000 years, green and full of rivers and full of people who swam and fished and painted and loved and buried each other with care beside the lakes. That record is in you. You are its vehicle. You are the latest expression of something very old, moving through the particular night that happens to be. Yours, carrying forward. Without effort, without intention, simply by virtue of being here and breathing. Everything that had to survive for you to exist. Sleep now. The green Sahara is already inside you, preserved in the pleasure of water sounds and the weight of a resting body, and the particular quality of rest that comes when you are finally, completely, willing to release the effort of holding the world together and trust it, as the people at Gobero must have trusted it each night for 5,000 years to still be there in the morning. It will be there. It is always there. And it is enough. Sleep well.